Hey everyone, Ken and Profi here. I'm back with another Blender tutorial. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to destroy things using rigid body dynamics. So this is going to be an overview of how to create really good art directable destructions inside of Blender. A beginner's guide, but also some things you might not be aware of that you can do in rigid body simulations. I know I certainly wasn't until I started jumping in here. So let's go ahead and jump into Blender and create a scene that we can demonstrate rigid body simulations and start destroying stuff, because destruction is just one of the most awesome things you can do in CG. Some people just want to watch the world burn. Name that movie in the comments. All right, so I'm going to create a wall here just by extruding that face up, and I'm going to just move it up along our grid here. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the scale, actually all the transforms, and I'm going to use the cell fracture add-on. If you're not familiar, this add-on comes with Blender. It's really cool. Cell fracture, just type that in and enable that. And there's a lot of different ways the add-on works. You can fracture by the object's faces or the object's verts, or you could add a particle system and fracture based on the particle system. You can also use the annotation pencil, which is actually my favorite way, because you can sort of pick where the object gets fractured. So if you select the pencil and come up here to placement, choose surface, then you can kind of draw points of intersection on an object, and the cell fracture add-on is going to decide, okay, the smallest points of fracture should be right there where you've kind of drawn all these intersecting lines. So this isn't like exact science. It's not like super precise, but I do find that the add-on does its best to try to be like, oh, okay, you want a smaller amount of breaks right here, wherever you've drawn these lines. So I like to do things like that just to break up this scale. So once our scribbles are looking just real smashing, let's go into quick effects, and there you see the cell fracture add-on. So right here you see the point source, and this is what I was talking about, where you can choose what it uses for fracturing the object. I'm going to choose the annotation pencil, and I'm going to set the noise all the way up to 1, and my source limit, I'll just crank this up to, let's go 300. For our purposes, that's fine. You can crank it up even more. And then recursion, we'll do 2 levels of this. That takes the pieces and then tries to fracture them even more. And then you can crank up the source limit for these as well. And these settings are primarily like the clamp. This is just so your computer doesn't, just explode into a million pieces whenever you set the recursion, because it can start trying to process fracturing objects all day. And then material, this is the material slot of the object. I don't actually have a material set, but if I did, you can pick the inside versus the outside of the material right there. All right, and then mass, it doesn't matter because we can set all that later, and I'll show you how to do that. The only thing I want to worry about is the scene collection. I'm going to dump all the fractured pieces into a collection. I'll just call it fractured. That way I can easily grab all the pieces once it's done. All right, our settings are the way we want. Let's go ahead and hit OK, and hopefully the add-on does its thing and doesn't take too long. And you can see it's trying its best to find those points of intersection and fracture it up right there. And it worked pretty well. Our initial object, so you see, there it is right there. I'll just hide that. And this works great. You can see we got smaller pieces up here, smaller pieces over here, and then some larger chunks. And this is, this will make for a more interesting destructive effect. And then of course it spit all of them into a collection here where we can right click and select everything, and we have all of our pieces just like that. We have our object, it's all broken up, and let's go ahead and turn these into rigid body simulation. So I can just grab one piece here and come over here to the right hand panel, the physics panel right there, and just with that piece selected, choose rigid body. And by default, it'll set it to active, and then it'll apply a mass to it, which we can set automatically so that it calculates the mass based on the scale of the object. So we won't do that here. And then we can change the shape. I like to use mesh. It gives a more accurate rendering. And then I usually like to turn the friction of the surface all the way up. So now if we press play, that object just falls into oblivion. Bye! play, you'll never see it again. It's gone and lost. And it doesn't look very cool because nothing else has any sort of collision or rigid body that it'll interact with. So let's go ahead and I'll press Z to get my pie menu, go to wireframe mode, and just grab all the objects and make sure you have that one with a rigid body that you set selected as well when you do that. And then you can just come up here to object, rigid body, and copy from active. And now if you grab any other object, you'll see it has the exact same settings applied. And now if you press play, everything just destroys. It just gets blown up. So everything just explodes into a million pieces, and that's fine if that's what you want. But that kind of introduces our first gotcha, which is the best case scenario to have a destruction simulation be art directable. You don't actually want anything exploding by default. You want to control how it kind of is destroyed. So I'm actually going to change the shape from mesh, which is more accurate, but I'm going to go down to convex hull, which think of that as kind of remeshing the object on the fly in a sense and getting more of the volume of the object. Mesh allows everything to kind of explode as it finds how tight all those objects are pressed up against each other. And because they all are rigid body objects, they just immediately, the weight of all of them causes them to just bump up against each other and explode. But if we change this shape back to convex hull, and now grab everything, and I'll go rigid body copy from active again, now we should get a very different result. You can see everything is a rigid body simulation still, but it just falls to the ground. So I've seen some people have trouble with that as well, where they're like, well, I don't want it to just blow up right away. I want to have some control over it. So that's one way. Now let's introduce some friction into the situation. So let's Shift A, and I'm going to add a plane and scale this up. And I'm just going to choose rigid body for this, but this time set this to passive. Passive just means it's not going to fall. It's just going to stay put. If we check animated, then it'll animate. Obviously, we can animate the keyframes of it. I'm just zooming in and moving this up to the very bottom of this wall so that we get a real accurate distance. And then I'm also going to check the friction all the way up. So now if we press play, our wall just collapses, which looks pretty cool. We got some cool destruction there, but the friction of the ground plane combined with gravity and the weight of all the objects allows everything to fall. Now I mentioned setting the weight of the objects. Right now everything has the exact same weight over here, but if we just grab all of these, and I can actually use our collection. Let me make sure our plane isn't inside. There we go. Right click and select objects. We can come here to object, rigid body, and calculate the mass of each of the individual objects. And you can see Blender has some preset material weights in there, which is really cool. So you could have them be lightweight objects like garbage, or you can make them be, my favorite, concrete. And then it'll just apply a mass to each object based on the scale of the object, which is really cool. And that further helps you get more realistic destruction simulations when everything has a separate mass, specifically if the bigger object is heavier than the little object. More important if you're doing actual visual effects work. So just by doing that, you can see we get a more accurate and interesting destruction simulation because the larger and heavier objects fall slower than these sort of tiny shards that immediately pop out. So already that's looking pretty cool. But again, say you don't necessarily want the simulation to just start right away like that. Well, something that wasn't obvious to me for a really long time is select one of your objects, a rigid body, and come over here to Dynamics. And under Dynamics, there's this Deactivation checkbox. And if you want the simulation to just not run at all, check that. And then you can choose Start Deactivated. And that means instead, when you press play, instead of everything just starting to run a rigid body simulation, it just won't do anything until something actually interacts with it. That's also a collision object or a rigid body simulation. So go ahead and check Start Deactivated. And then with that done, I'm going to select all the other objects and do, once again, copy from active. So now when you press play, absolutely nothing happens. And this is actually the state of things that you really want to be in, because if you're doing something like a building destruction or a ground burst or something like that, you want everything to be as stable as possible so that then you can control how you destroy it. So I'll give you an example. If I press Shift A and add an icosphere here, I like using icosphere just because of the geometry, and I can put it right up here where these small shards are, right in the middle of my object here. And I'm going to create this as a rigid body object, and I'll just set it to passive. You can see we press play, nothing happens. But if we check this animated button, then it's going to look for motion on the object. And even if you don't animate a keyframe, it'll still find it and just cause the whole thing to just destroy. And this is really cool because now you can localize where that actual destruction is coming from. So you say, well, I want this to be smaller. I can move it over here, down here, and maybe it's a cannon firing a wall and it's just destroying the bottom of it. Boom. Now you're getting more into like, this is actually art directable. You can change how your whole simulation works because it starts sort of on your timetable. And again, this is animated, so I can move this over here and press I and set a keyframe on the location. So I'll jump ahead to frame 50, have the ball just animate right into the wall like that. Press I on the location. And nothing happens. And let's make sure we check animated back on that object. So now the wall is completely stable, which is what we want, until that point of impact with the ball. And now we get some really cool destruction. So something I've seen and a lot of Blender users do is they don't set that start deactivated. And so then their simulation starts to run and everything kind of settles before their point of impact that they want. So doing it like this allows you to control exactly when and how that destruction happens, which is pretty cool. And now let's apply a constraint. So this is another way of sort of advancing up your knowledge of rigid bodies to use constraints. You are able to really art direct the simulation a lot more. So I'm going to make sure I have one selected again, and then select all of them. Come up here to rigid body, same menu, and we're going to choose this connect option right there. And this might take a minute depending on how many you have. You can see a few locators it added up here, but what you want to do before getting out of this menu, so you'll see a menu pop up on the bottom left, connect rigid bodies. The connection pattern, switch it from selected to active to chain by distance. And what you'll see is there they all kind of pop out and follow the individual origins of the object that they're constraining to. So this allows you to have each fractured object essentially parented to its own locator, allowing us to do things like disable collisions and adjust the breakability of that object. So how likely is that one piece going to fracture away from the rest of the wall? So this is really, really cool. It does kind of get buggy, so just make sure you're saving often when you're using these constraints. I like to do the same thing with all my constraints, grab all of them and just move them to a new collection, just so that you can easily grab them at any point. And by the way, if you want to reference this Blender file, then all my Blender files from my tutorials are available for my Patreon members, so you can go check that out. And now with all these constraints in place, we can see what the simulation looks like now. Totally different. The object is behaving kind of as if it were all just one object together. And this is also how you would do sort of a fractured object falling and then hitting the ground and fracturing. You want to make use of constraints like this. So right now it doesn't look very cool because it's kind of trying to keep all of these objects constrained together. It's all like saying, okay, be snug together, don't go anywhere. What happens when we start to introduce some breakability into these constraints? So let me grab a few constraints up here and I'll just check breakable. And the threshold is how easily does this break. If you have a really heavy object, then and a high threshold, then it's not going to break away from the group very easily. But if you have a low threshold, let's try a threshold of 1 and let's try making a lot of these objects be breakable. By default, if you check 1, you can see that these aren't breakable. But if you grab a bunch of these and then hold down Option, it might be Alt on a Windows keyboard, and then come over here and check breakable, Now all of those that you've selected should have the same key applied. And so now if we run our simulation again, you should see this wall break all those locators that we said, okay, you can break apart from each other. They fractured really easily, but the rest stayed still. So this is another really cool way of, like I said, all about art directing, what parts of your simulation you want to break and destroy, and you can sort of pick and make more interesting simulations like that. Now you can also animate this breakability factor. What I can do is say, let's bring this back. Frame 20, the intersection, the point of impact happens around frame 30. Let's say I want the wall to just stay as one piece until it hits the ground, which would be around frame 45. And at that point, I want everything to break and shatter. So now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of like animating destruction, which is really fun. So we can grab, again, I'm going to hide my fractured collection. This is why it's so useful to put all these into collections. And I'm going to grab just one point here, and I will have this unchecked on breakable around frame 40. I'll keyframe that. Okay, so now I have a keyframe. It's not going to be breakable until frame 40. And then on frame 41, I'll make it breakable. Okay, and then I'll keyframe that. And I'll also set the threshold really high, so like 100. And I'll keyframe that value as well. And then I'll move up to about frame 50 and set the threshold really low to 1. So that at first, even that first impact, I'm getting another level of detail where it breaks some. The heavier parts will be able to break, but not much. Until frame 50, everything should just sort of shatter into just total destruction. So I can kind of scrub that timeline, make sure that my animation is all set. Everything's able to be breakable. On frame 41, it's not able to be broken before that. And then by frame 50, it's just all bets are off. Everything should be able to shatter. Okay, now I want this applied to, say, all the objects here. So I can just grab all my constraints and press Control L and link animation data. Now this is going to link the data of that one locator no matter what I do. So if I change this animation, it'll change it for all the locators as well. So if you want just half of them, which I might do that, I'll just do half of these up here. So I'm going to hide the plane. Make sure you have this locator selected, and then shift select a bunch of locators that you want to have that exact same animation, and press Control L, and we'll do link animation data. Now that's going to link the animation no matter what changes you make. Any of these locators will get the same change affected. So you want to be careful when you do that. I might, since I broke this up into kind of top and lower, I might move these into a separate collection, and I'll just name these top constraints. Again, just kind of getting more into the nitty gritty. You don't have to do it necessarily like this. There's plenty of other ways you can do it. But now I can select the inverse of this. Grab these. I don't want this sphere. And I can move these into a lower constraints group. Again, however you want to organize it, totally up to you. But basically the lower constraints, you can see they don't have the animation. They're still not breakable. But these up here, these all have that same animation. So basically what I'm saying is the lower part of my wall, that should all kind of stay together. The top part should still get that breaking and then the slow shattering. So we can see what this looks like when we bring back our wall and run our simulation. There we go. Pretty cool. Let me grab this plane, our passive plane, and slide it out so that we get some more that destruction beauty. Impact, top part flies off and then crumbles into a million pieces, and the bottom part of our wall all stays constrained together. And why? Because these constraints don't have any breakability down here, our lower constraints. Our upper constraints all have no breakability until frame 41. And what's great, because we linked the animation data, if you say, no, I want it to happen even sooner, I want it to happen, say, right here, you can just slide those keyframes around and run it again. Now it starts to break sooner. You can adjust the timing and you get a really cool art directable destruction simulation. And so now it's just a matter of playing with the locators, the timing, the animation of them, when you want things to start breaking, how heavy you want the objects to be, how resistant to breakability you want. So say we drag this keyframe out, or maybe, you know, they don't break until frame 100 and you start getting more timing involved there. That looks a little funny. You need a little more gravity. I'm just playing now, but look, this chunk of wall hits right at frame 54. So what if they don't start breaking until frame 54, and then all bets are off at frame 80? Now you can easily start to play with that. That looks really cool. You can also override the iterations. So if you crank up the iterations here, you get a smoother and more realistic simulation, but it also slows down your bake time as well. So just be mindful of that. It is cool to crank up the iterations on the breakability of these. If you find things are getting kind of jittery and not looking very realistic, I would crank that up as high as you can for your computer's needs, and you'll get some really cool results. So obviously there's so much more you can do with all of this, but I wanted to give you kind of a rundown, basic level of how to use the deactivation, how to use the constraints within rigid body, the breakability of all of these, so that you can go and make some really cool destruction effects. So that's it for this video. Make sure you play around with rigid body simulations, make some really cool destruction effects. Who doesn't love destruction? It's one of my favorite things. So I think I've said that already. If you want this file to mess around with, reverse engineer it, I'll make it available to all the Patreon members. Shout out to all of you guys. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.